Aaron, thank you for being here. I'm happy to have Aaron Katz here, who's the founder and CEO of ClickHouse, a fund for investment that we recently made. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the company, kind of its formation, and where they're going. So thanks for being here today.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Maybe for those of the folks in the audience that don't know much about ClickHouse, can you give us a quick kind of overview of the company and sort of what it does and, the problems that you solve for customers?
Sure. So there are a few questions there. So ClickHouse is an open source analytical database, short for Clickstream Data Warehouse or ClickHouse. It was developed inside a company in Europe called Yandex, and it was open sourced in 2016. And that's where I first discovered it at the previous company I worked at. And it quickly grew in popularity. Thousands of companies adopted it, like Deutsche Bank and Microsoft, Uber, and eBay for a very diverse set of use cases. And in 2021, I embarked on a project to start a company around it, ClickHouse Inc. And so myself and my two co-founders, Alexei, the creator of ClickHouse, who's based in Amsterdam, and Yuri, who I met when he was running engineering at Netflix, started the company. So it's a Silicon Valley venture-backed startup. We're 4.5 years old and things are growing quickly, which I'm sure we'll get into. But it's a database, so it solves a wide array of use cases.
One thing would be great, just to kind of get a sense of sort of your background. What were you doing before this that ultimately led you to, ClickHouse as an opportunity that you wanted to go after?
I started my career at Sun Microsystems and then went to PeopleSoft and then did a startup in the late 90s here in the city. And then joined Salesforce 23 years ago when it was a small venture-backed startup. And that was in early '02. It went public in '04, spent 10 years at Salesforce. I left in 2014 to lead the go-to-market functions at a company called Elasticsearch, which is now a public company, Elastic, under the ticker ESTC. We took that company public in 2018. I stepped out during COVID and I was in my mid-40s, started thinking about what I was going to do with the next chapter of my career. And at the time, there were kind of three different avenues I could go down. The first is kind of stay in my lane as a mercenary CRO and go work at a later stage private company. The second would be do what you do, is become an investor. It was kind of in vogue at the time for ex-sales leaders to become VCs, or start a company or run a company.
Yeah.
And I kept coming back to wanting to stay as an operator and try to broaden my scope. And that's when ClickHouse was presented to me. And so I was able to pull off the engineering of the company, and here we are 4.5 years later.
Gotcha. And, it's interesting because we were investors in, Confluent and HashiCorp. And so we've seen the kind of the open source migration to, a cloud-based offering. So obviously when you thought about incubating this and sort of spinning it out, all that, there was obviously a ton of adoption, amongst what I would describe as kind of forward-thinking technology companies like the Ubers of the world, et cetera. So when you kind of thought about architecting it as a cloud service, though, that's a pretty big step in terms of operationalizing that. So, how did you think about that journey of like, okay, we need to be in a position where we can actually start delivering this product as a cloud service? And, what are the challenges that are kind of tied to that in terms of going from open source to now kind of being able to charge for that managed service?
So your experience at Confluent would probably be the best corollary in the sense that Kafka was developed inside LinkedIn.
Right.
It was essentially spun out to form Confluent with Jay and Neha. And like a lot of open source companies, they start by selling support for open source users.
Right.
And then they build an enterprise version of the software that has proprietary features. And then they ultimately move to a managed service or a cloud product.
Right.
And Mongo's done that with their Atlas service. Elastic did it with Elastic Cloud. Confluent did it with Confluent Cloud. And having lived that experience at Elastic, it's a very difficult transition.
Yeah.
Both from an R&D standpoint, to have these different deployment models, to migrate your customers from self-managed or on-prem deployments to a managed service. And that's largely why I raised as much capital as I did, is I kind of wanted to skip that first step and go straight to a managed service.
Right.
And knowing that I wouldn't be monetizing a lot of the on-prem or self-managed deployments. We opportunistically sold support to customers like Netflix or ServiceNow or IBM or Disney, but the business model was going after cloud. We really did that to understand their use case, get close to the customer, get them referenceable. But really the design was go straight into the cloud market. And that's what led us down the path to develop ClickHouse Cloud.
Gotcha. And were there certain hero customers that sort of said, okay, I'm all in, I'm going to join you on this journey to kind of this managed cloud? Like what were What was it like getting those first kind of meaningful customers onto the platform, so to speak?
Yeah, so we had 50 design partners, which is a lot
That is a
to
lot, yeah.
manage. And they were using open source ClickHouse. And so we engaged with them and said, if you were to move to a fully managed service, what are the characteristics of that offering?
Yeah.
Because it just can't be hosting an open source database. That's not fundamentally different. It's
Right.
not that different. It's not that difficult to host ClickHouse or any other open source database running it in AWS or on-prem. And so the primary benefits came down to scalability, cost, and performance. ClickHouse is known for being extremely performant in terms of query latency and very efficient in terms of how it stores data. So those are kind of table stakes.
Right.
So then what sort of features would you develop that would convince somebody to move from or compel somebody to move from on-prem to a managed service? And it was all of the operational benefits and the cost savings. And that is what led us down the path to redesign the underlying table engine to enable the separation of compute and storage. And so it's a columnar database where if you're running it on-prem, it's a shared nothing architecture. And when you separate compute and storage, your data is now stored in object storage. So
Right.
something like S3 or GCS or Azure Blob Storage.
Yep.
And then your compute nodes are stateless. And that enables auto scaling and idling because a lot of these analytical workloads are very bursty.
Right.
And there's a lot of variability. And you really don't want to pay for compute during periods when you're not going to need it.
Yep.
So by having this serverless architecture with compute storage separation, you have all of the operating benefits of a serverless offering to where you only pay for what you use.
Right.
To answer your question directly, I think I mentioned some of the more prominent design partners, Netflix, Disney, Instacart, Microsoft, that were using open source ClickHouse and were very helpful in terms of coming up with some
The
recommendations.
feature set, like what are the requirements?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. One of the things that I've always found is super interesting, obviously, about the company is the adoption has kind of been nothing short of astonishing in terms of customer adoption. And part of that's because there's just this very wide surface area of sort of different use cases where companies can use ClickHouse. And so how do you think about sort of the boundaries around which the product offering, right, and the use cases, as you're going to market and kind of, touching more and more customers, are there boundaries? Or, are you kind of saying, look, there's a very wide surface area we can go after. We're going to go after all of it. Like, how do you think about kind of just managing as you're executing?
I think that's why we're so excited, honestly, about the opportunity, because that broad surface area is just a massive addressable market. And when I first encountered ClickHouse, it was around logging. And then as I started to observe these adoption trends, it extended well beyond that. We lost a big metrics project at eBay. I had heard people replacing traditional data warehouses with ClickHouse. And then what probably got me the most excited about it were companies were building real-time applications on top of it. Fast forward now to where we are today, we've got several thousand customers on our cloud service, and the use cases kind of fall in three broad areas. And the first is observability, which
Right.
I touched on, which is typically internally facing logs, metrics, and traces.
Right.
The second is cloud data warehousing. And so, the incumbents that you have in the first category would be Elastic, Datadog, and a number of others,
Right.
Splunk. And the second category, you've got traditional data warehousing like Teradata, et cetera, Vertica. And then you've got the more modern cloud data warehouses like Snowflake, Google BigQuery, Amazon Redshift. And then on the real-time analytics side, there were three popular open source OLAP engines. It was ClickHouse, Apache Pinot. And there's now a company behind Apache Pinot called Startree. And then Apache Druid. And there's a company behind that called Imply. And from where I sat, ClickHouse was emerging as the winner in that third category,
Right.
Which I thought, for me, was one of the most exciting. I feel like the first two are very defined, and the last one really is where the next 10 years are going to be focused on just these real-time applications and just with these massive amounts of data,
Yeah.
how you can expose them to your customers in a very efficient way. And then, with the emergence of ChatGPT, we have this new AI ML category
Right.
that ClickHouse has really gained popularity around. And I can touch on that if you're interested as well.
Yeah, it'd be great. Like maybe some examples of sort of this, now that we're kind of moving in this world of AI and agents kind of operating all the time, like how does the ClickHouse offering kind of fit into that?
Well, we're being used for a diverse set of use cases in AI specifically. So earlier this year, we had our first user conference here in San Francisco. We had Anthropic talk about how they're using ClickHouse for observability. We had OpenAI present how they're using ClickHouse for a diverse set of use cases, ranging from a billing backend to observability. And we had Tesla talk about their use case where they're ingesting 1 billion events per second into ClickHouse. They've got a table with a quadrillion rows.
That's incredible.
It's mind blowing. So if you think about what are the characteristics of that type of database, it's got to be able to ingest data very efficiently. It's got to be able to store that data and compress that data in a very efficient way. And then it's got to provide lightning fast query execution.
Yeah.
ClickHouse is emerging as one of the few databases in the world that can satisfy those conditions. And you can extend it even further. Weights and Biases Weave product is built on ClickHouse Cloud. LangChain's Langsmith service around LLM observability is built on ClickHouse Cloud. Vercel is using us to expose build logs to their customers.
Yeah.
And I could kind of go on and on. So
Yeah.
we're just getting a lot of tailwinds from these AI use cases, because if you think about like a single semantic search, whether it's on ChatGPT or some other interface, so you've got some text prompt, and what is occurring on the back end is the technology's converting that into SQL queries.
Right.
And that SQL query is pinging a database, and then it's responding with results. It's learning from that, and it's going back with another query.
Right.
So what's required there? Extremely low latency.
Yep.
And then all of those queries are generating a lot of data, and they want to store those events for analytics. They want to store the embeddings, and so they want to use it as a feature store. And so like one single use case of being a backend database for a semantic experience could lead to like 10 other use cases around other analytics.
Right. That's fascinating. One of the things I always found was interesting was that a lot of the early adoption was sort of like almost like this product-led kind of motion. And it's interesting to say that in some respects, the company's still in very early innings because you're a pretty scaled business to begin with. But how do you think about shifting now where you're scaling out the teams, right? You brought on a new CRO, which we can certainly talk about. Is the approach changing from a go-to-market perspective now that you've got all these amazing use cases? Is it more just sort of a let's add headcount here and kind of just really go after the broader market? Like how are you thinking about that from a scaling perspective?
Yeah, that's a very timely question. We're spending a lot of time thinking about that. So when we started the company, I said, okay, what are the two most successful infrastructure software companies over the last 5 years? And from where I sat, it was Datadog and Snowflake. And they approached go-to-market very differently from my perspective. Datadog was much more PLG, developer-led, try and buy,
right,
pay as you go, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
And then Snowflake was, we're going to go after the enterprise, and we're going to invest heavily in sales and marketing. It's going to be expensive. It's going to take time, but we're going to capture it. And they both were successful in those approaches, but they're very different. And I thought the Datadog model just seems so much easier.
Yeah. Ship a product, customers pick it up, right?
Yeah, just make it frictionless.
Yeah.
Especially now, nobody wants to talk to somebody in sales if they don't have to.
Right.
Developers want to experience this technology, especially when you have open source roots where you never have to talk to anybody. You just download the software and deploy it, and
right,
you never have to engage with anybody in any sort of company. And so that was like the first design principle, was we are not going to build a heavy sales and marketing machine.
Yeah.
We're going to build a service that developers love. We're going to make it easy to onboard, easy to get your data in, easy to start running your queries, easy to add your credit card,
right,
and just start going. And so that was kind of the design principle of the service itself. Fast forward to where we are today, we're clearly getting pulled up market. I mentioned a lot of the digital native companies that we have on our platform, but now we're getting pulled into the enterprise, which requires a totally different motion, because now we're getting pulled into lengthy POCs, all of the reps and warranties that go along with these contractual conversations, selling to the enterprise. And what was typically a 30-day sales cycle is now could be a 30-month sales cycle, right, in some cases. And so, we brought on board a new CRO, as you mentioned, Kevin Egan. And I had worked with Kevin back at Salesforce 20 plus years ago. And he then went on to lead enterprise sales at Dropbox and then North American sales at Slack. So we've got a new CRO that's going to really move the company into the enterprise. And then we hired recently a new CFO, as you and I talked about. Jimmy Sexton joined us from Snowflake,
right,
who knows this consumption model extremely well. He joined us just recently. And so we're just kind of bringing the management team up to reflect, where we think the company's going.
Right. It's exciting times for sure. One of the things I thought was also interesting was we were also investors in GitLab. And I know culturally you kind of have a sort of a remote first kind of, operating sort of model. Talk about that. I mean, because I think you've got folks working across multiple continents now, right? So when you think about sort of as the company scales, how do you scale that culture and kind of maintain that culture when everybody is, kind of remote first?
Yeah, well, I would encourage you to ask Bill at GitLab his experience with ClickHouse. He's a great advocate. We were just emailing yesterday, coincidentally. And GitLab's been an early design partner of ours, and their use cases are very diverse.
Yeah.
So it's a great use case. The distributed approach to work, I think, has its pros and cons. And I try not to be too dogmatic in one direction or another, because I do think it's got amazing benefits around talent acquisition and hiring. And I also think it's got drawbacks in terms of coordination and collaboration and problem solving.
Right.
So we do have employees in 20 different countries around the world. It reflects in our revenue distribution. Over half of our revenue is outside of the US, over 40% in Europe, over 10% in Asia. When we got started, I put people on the ground in almost every major market in Europe and Asia, both on the engineering side and then subsequently on the go-to-market side. We are deployed in 31 different cloud regions, which is a lot of overhead to manage each one of these regions. They all have different economics on the underlying infrastructure costs. Whereas like if we're in US East, maybe not a great example with the recent outage, but one of our largest regions, obviously our unit cost is very low because we're operating that at scale.
Right.
When I spin up a region in Tokyo or Singapore or Mumbai, the early costs of that region are very high.
Right.
And so that provides some gross margin headwind.
Yeah.
But over half of our customers, not just our revenue, but over half of our customers are outside of the US as well.
Right.
So I think kind of the international dimensions of the company are pretty unique for a company of our size, 400 employees plus or minus, to have such a broad international footprint.
Yeah.
But it's showing up in revenue and customers. So, appears to be working.
Yeah. That's great. That's exciting. When you think about sort of, kind of like the longer term as you're kind of scaling out this business, one of the things we always like to talk about is sort of just the competition, right? Because you do have such big surface area. There's certainly no slouch of like Snowflake and others that you might kind of end up running, into, competitively. So how do you think about what the competitive landscape looks like now? And like, what do you think it's going to look like 5 years from now as you think about scaling the business?
Well, the competitive landscape is very diverse, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
As I went through those different use cases, I mentioned just a few.
Right.
And there's so many more. And when we look at the competitive analysis of where people are migrating from, or people that are, evaluating us against, I could have 30 competitors in any given quarter.
Right.
And that's probably, I would take the over on that number. So there's the obvious ones that we talked about.
Right.
And these are great companies with, very successful go-to-market motions, very talented sales teams, a lot of disruptive technology. So like, we're not dismissing the competition whatsoever.
Right.
We're taking them very seriously. And I refer to those as kind of the incumbents. And then there's the disruptors like ourselves, and then those that are trying to disrupt us. And I think about those equally.
Right.
Like, I don't want to just look forward and say, okay, we're going to go heavily after, I don't know, pick one, Snowflake, for example.
Yeah.
But I want to look in the rearview mirror and be like, who's coming after us? And there's some interesting disruptive technology that we see emerging that we keep a very close eye on to make sure that we keep this competitive advantage that we have around price and performance.
Yep.
And so I don't want to, I don't make a habit of picking on the competition like some people do in our industry. I've got a lot of respect for them. I see a lot of parallels with, for example, Salesforce. When I started there, Siebel was the dominant vendor in the category. Right. And their customers were dissatisfied, largely based off cost and complexity.
Yeah.
And so Salesforce,
if they ever got it installed, actually, right?
If they got it, I don't know. See, on the call center side, Siebel was very good, but especially around Salesforce automation, salespeople did not love using Siebel.
Right.
So we thought, well, what if we had a managed service in the cloud that salespeople like to use? And that was 23 years ago.
Right.
And then you could draw the same example with Elastic and Splunk, for example. Splunk was very expensive, and they had what was perceived to be a punitive pricing model based off data ingest.
Right.
And so at Elastic, we said we could be a very viable alternative to Splunk for logging.
Right.
I see those same parallels with some of our competitors today.
Yeah. It's interesting, the experience you had at Elastic and obviously the other companies that you've been at before, how does that inform kind of your view on leadership and management, right? When you're thinking about, 400 today, continue to add people, how do you think about kind of like maintaining sort of the same sort of culture and dynamic of execution and performance and all that just be interesting to get your take on how you think about scaling as you continue to grow, right, and become much bigger as an organization.
It all starts and ends with engineering. And that's a realization that I've come to in this role that I really didn't have in the past. I was always focused on go-to-market, and I had great products to sell and to market and to support, but I had never been responsible for product development like I am in this role. Now, fortunately, I've got Alexei and Yuri, who are, with Alexei, you've got this brilliant engineer who came up with ClickHouse. He named it. This is his life's work.
Mm-hmm.
He's in Amsterdam with the core engineering team. And we've got about 50 core engineers that just focus on the database engine. And then I've got Yuri, who when I met at Netflix, he was running platform engineering. And he led Netflix's migration to the cloud. He was at the time, I think, AWS's largest customer.
Mm-hmm.
He then left Netflix and went to Google and had a very senior engineering role at Google. I think he had 1,000 engineers. He ran the cloud console, dev tools, et cetera, for Google Cloud.
Right.
He's been building distributed systems around open source databases for 20 years. So I think you have the three of us are very different and have very complementary skill sets.
Yeah.
And so when I watch how Yuri runs the engineering organization, it mirrors kind of how I think about running a sales organization,
mm-hmm.
where you've got high degrees of accountability, you've got very tight timeframes, you don't tolerate leakage, slippage, feature creep, et cetera. I mean, all of those things are going to occur.
Right.
You have this maniacal focus on reliability. We're a database service. The service needs to be up and running.
Right.
You have this maniacal focus on security. People are putting their data in our managed service. It needs to be highly secure.
Right.
You have this maniacal focus on scalability. I mean, what internet service scaled more over the last 10 years than Netflix, for example? And then it just kind of cascades down the organization. We get the company together twice a year in person. We were just in Amsterdam a few weeks ago. We were in Barcelona earlier in the year. We're going to Tokyo next spring. And so we get together in person. And
is that bringing everybody from all regions together?
That's bringing everybody together. We'll see how long we can continue that.
Yeah.
Because you get 400, will be 500 by the time we're in Tokyo.
Right.
That's a lot of people to bring together and have a productive week. We're starting to invest in these hubs, like physical hubs in New York, London, Menlo Park, where people are going into the office. But again, I'm not going to have this mandate that there's a return to work.
Right.
I think the company performing so well helps there.
Yeah.
Because it appears to be working. And I think if you see the growth slow, execution, start to get a little wobbly on the R&D side, it could cause us to rethink that approach.
Right.
We do have a big hub in Amsterdam.
Mm-hmm.
When I started the company, I moved the core team from Moscow to Amsterdam. And then my head of Europe is based there. And he worked for me in the past. Most of the management team, coming back to your previous question, worked with me except Jimmy.
Right.
Either at Salesforce or at Elastic.
Right.
So there's a lot of shared experiences and trust amongst the leadership team.
Yeah. I think what's interesting also is that, when you think about sort of scaling at the stage and scale that you're at, is that, recruiting and maintaining that bar of recruiting exceptional talent gets harder, right? Just because the sheer numbers of people that you're trying to hire, and obviously, it's a competitive environment where others are, spending a lot to try to recruit others. So how do you kind of win in the recruiting battle, right? When you're sort of when you brought Jimmy on or Kevin, right? What was it that sort of got them to say, this is 100% where I want to plant my flag for the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Well, maybe I'll put Jimmy and Kevin aside because they're hopefully kind of one-time hires. So then maybe the question is how do I hire 100 engineers in the next year?
Yeah.
How do I hire 100 salespeople in the next year? And we have this broad international reach that I touched on.
Mm-hmm.
So, the company performing well and the recent financing that you participated in, really aids in that in terms of company credibility.
Right.
We're no longer this wishful thinking startup. We're going to go for it. We're there. Revenue's growing very quickly. We're adding over 100 customers a month. And so I think people now look at the company and say, the risk is not penciled out, but it's very different than it was 2 years ago.
Right.
A. B, having a really healthy balance sheet. Say, we're going to be here in 5 to 10 years.
Right.
And hopefully a lot longer.
Right.
That pencils out some risk. We can afford to be more competitive on comp and equity.
Mm-hmm.
When the equity value is very real and it's much higher than it was a year ago. And when we've got a balance sheet, now we can compete with more, healthier salaries than a venture-backed startup.
Right.
And then we can hire people in more obscure locations. And I don't mean to use obscure in a negative way, but when you're hiring engineers in Poland, you may not be competing against Anthropic
Right.
or OpenAI.
Right.
Because if I hire that same engineer in San Francisco and I'm competing with these companies, it's going to be very difficult for me
Yeah.
to win that.
Yeah.
Not to say we haven't, but we all know how insane some of these comp packages are getting,
Right.
especially here in the Bay Area. And so we still hire people in the Bay Area, but if I look out a year from now, I would say 70 to 80% of our hires are going to be in places like Spain, Portugal, Germany,
Yeah.
Singapore, Australia, India,
Yeah.
versus the Bay Area, New York.
What's interesting also is that when you think about sort of recruiting engineers, one of the things I was always fascinated by was the sheer product velocity that ClickHouse has in terms of just features and products that you ship. It's sort of mind blowing, right? And so it strikes me that a lot of engineers are like, okay, I get to work on really complex, hard problems, but be part of a team that's actually just constantly shipping sort of new products and features, and that's got to be pretty exciting for any kind of engineer that wants to work, at a company that's got that. Yeah.
And I think from a sales standpoint, the sales team loves it because they constantly have a new feature set to go and talk to their customers about.
Yeah.
And a new use case they can support.
Yeah.
Say, oh, you're using this for observability. It's a subset of the same data set that you're putting in a cloud data warehouse.
Yep.
We can consolidate your tech stack and remove 2 to 3 specialized databases with one database that satisfies a lot of different use cases.
It's interesting. So how does that feedback loop work, right? Because you've got a lot of customers using a variety of different use cases. So I'd imagine if you've got someone in the product group who's identifying that and then relaying that back to the sales organization to say, by the way, you can talk to this customer about this particular kind of problem set, et cetera. Is that something that you've kind of embedded in terms of the way in which you think about sort of how the go-to-market motion works?
Well, the open source definitely helps there.
Right.
I use Capital One as an example. So what's the bear thesis on the company? The bear thesis is, if you ask me, who are the 5 traditional retail banks using your cloud service? Who are the 5 largest telcos using your cloud service?
Mm-hmm.
Who are the 5 largest healthcare companies, pharma companies? I don't have a great answer. I can say Cisco Systems is using us. I can say Telstra in Australia is using us. Sony in Asia is using us. But I can't list off, I can't tell you right now that on our cloud service, I've got Citibank, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America,
right.
Wells Fargo. So a couple of weeks ago, we had Capital One present in New York at a user conference and go on record about how they're using ClickHouse open source. And it's a pretty sizable deployment.
Mm-hmm.
It's mission critical. And then they talked about their intent to move to our cloud service. And it's for a different use case. But we don't get into that account without open source.
Right.
Right. And that's the frictionless approach and why open source is such a wonderful distribution model.
Yeah.
Because it can get you in. Deutsche Bank is similar. They've been using us for years on record talking about their different use cases.
Mm-hmm.
So I think comes back to your previous question, which is like moving up market, moving into the enterprise.
Right.
How does the company develop those repeatable go-to-market motions to where now, a year from now, when you and I are talking, I have a much better answer to these are the top 20 enterprise customers we landed in the last 12 months.
Right. And as part of that battle, though, like a JP Morgan saying, look, we just want to do it on-prem. Right. We're okay. We can kind of run this, we'll stick with the open source. I mean, that's the big challenge, right? Is sort of getting them comfortable with kind of working on your cloud, basically.
That would be the historical obstacle that we've neutralized by building an on-prem distribution of our cloud binary. Which I'm completely contradicting myself from when I started the company because I'm like, I don't want to sell on-prem software. And here I am building on-prem software. And, Tesla was one of our early customers for this deployment model because they wanted to run it in their own data center.
Sure.
They were using open source ClickHouse, but they wanted access to our cloud binary.
Mm-hmm.
And so we license our cloud binary to them and we support them. It's our proprietary IP.
Right.
We did that with Alibaba in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
We can't obviously run a cloud service in China,
right?
But ClickHouse is very popular in China.
Right.
And so we work closely with Alibaba Cloud to have them redistribute our cloud binary with compute storage separation and all the proprietary features on their cloud service in China. And we get a percentage of the revenue they generate. And so that's going to be our ClickHouse private deployment. That's like a fully containerized version of ClickHouse running in your environment.
Right.
It could be on the cloud. It could be on-prem. Anthropic is another example of that.
Okay.
They licensed our cloud binary. They're running that in AWS, but they're not using our fully managed service.
Right.
In between those two, which is fully managed ClickHouse Cloud on AWS, Google Cloud, or Azure, ClickHouse Private or government, for example, if a government organization wants to run it in an air-gapped environment with no network connection, then they can license our cloud binary. You've got bring your own cloud. that sits in the middle.
Right.
And that's where you decouple the data plane from the control plane.
Okay.
And the data plane sits in the customer's VPC. And so the data doesn't leave their account.
Right.
And the control plane is managed by us.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. I know we're running short on time, so two more questions.
Yep.
You were at Elastic really early, to the point where then it went public, and then you were, there when it was a publicly traded company. One of the interesting sort of memes, I guess, or themes that are kind of going around in the Valley is you have all of these incredibly large companies, Anduril, SpaceX, Databricks, you name it, who are kind of consciously choosing not to go public. And not to ask you, for you to give me a timeline, but how do you think about, given your experience at Elastic, how do you think about sort of the path for ClickHouse in terms of, when are you ready to be a public company? Is that something that's on your mind these days? Or are you kind of just like, look, we've got a long way to go. We'll figure that out when the time is right. But how do you think about sort of like the trade-offs and the choice of actually doing that?
Yeah, it's somewhere in the middle
Okay.
where it's a long ways out and it's on my mind. Revenue's growing quickly. If this was 2005, we'd probably be a public company.
Public, right?
Because we're operating at that scale right now.
Yeah.
Maybe not with our gross margin profile. We need to improve our gross margins over the next 4 quarters.
Right.
We've got a plan to do that. So we're going to have, I think, more public company-esque gross margins a year from now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that's just a requirement.
Right.
I don't think public investors would be thrilled with that specific unit economic characteristic. I joined Salesforce, as I mentioned, when it was a startup, went public a few years later. Elastic, we took the company public 4 years after I joined. I understand why companies stay private longer, like Databricks and others. And they have this asymmetric advantage. They can forward invest. They don't have to deal with public investor sentiment. They don't have to deal with people shorting their stock. They have to deal with employees looking at the stock price every single day.
Right. The water cooler conversation of where the stock price is.
Yeah.
Right.
They've got access to what seems like an unlimited amount of capital in the private markets.
Right.
They can do employee tenders, once a year, however frequently they want to do it. So their employees get some liquidity.
Right.
So that satisfies that. The value of the company keeps going up. So that helps with employee sentiment. Early investors can cash out because there's now like an active secondary market around the stock. So I get all of that.
Yeah.
I'm probably a little bit more traditional in the sense that I just think it's healthy for a company to enter the public markets, to really diversify their shareholder base, to be accountable to public market shareholders.
Sort of enforces the
investors.
discipline, right, in terms of how you run the business as well.
And I kind of get the reasons why companies don't do it.
Right.
Why Stripe doesn't do it, and Databricks and SpaceX and others.
Right.
So I fall somewhere in between. Like,
Gotcha.
I don't want to rush the company into an IPO prematurely.
Right.
But I look at how Figma is trading and how that company performed, and I look at it's such a great company.
Yeah.
And it's such a huge market opportunity that I would like to follow that type of approach into the public markets. Not
Makes
to say
sense.
we have to wait to get to the same revenue scale, but it didn't slow Dylan down.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah.
So I asked this of all my founders and CEOs because it's sort of a timely conversation. Are we in an AI bubble?
You're better qualified to answer that question than I am because you're the one writing the checks and somehow convincing your LPs that you should invest in these companies at these valuations.
Right.
I'll go on record. I sat out the recent rounds at both OpenAI and Anthropic, not because I didn't like the price. I actually think they're well priced relative to what I hear they're doing in terms of revenue scale, growth on a multiple basis.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like they're overpriced to me, but largely just because I'm already so long, enterprise software, like I don't need any more exposure.
Right.
So if you put a gun to my head and said, just answer the question, yes or no, it feels a little bit like 2021 to me right now. And I don't know if I'd give you that same answer a month or two ago.
Right.
It feels a little frothy. So I guess that would be a yes if you forced me to answer the question.
Yeah.
But it's not an obvious yes.
Well, I think what's interesting is sort of this tale of two cities, right? At the same time that you see all this, kind of evidence of this frothiness, whether it's valuations or, founders taking secondary after their Series A, you've heard about some of these things. At the same time, you can go and look at companies and say, I've never seen companies grow and scale as fast as any other time in history in Silicon Valley. And so it's kind of this fascinating dynamic. But so I was talking to one of my other founders and he said, when 2 PhDs can raise a first round at a multi-billion-dollar valuation without ever having run a business, he said, we're absolutely in a bubble.
Well, I don't want to be too hypocritical because we raised a round at a multi-billion-dollar valuation.
Fair
The
point.
difference is we're not PhDs. And we had done it before.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
but
Well,
anyway.
I thought it was actually interesting. We were talking about this off camera, where how I think there was somebody that you had known that had written a book that had talked about the fact that the cohort of the most successful founders are those that generally start companies in their mid 40s, which is it's very counterintuitive to the Silicon Valley fairy tale story of like the 28-year-old founder that's starting something.
Yeah, we were talking about that. So the author of that book is Freddie Karras, who's a good friend of mine. We started at Salesforce, and then he went on to start Okta with Todd, and he wrote a book called From Zero to IPO, and it's about Okta's journey from incorporation through a public offering. And that is one data point that he talked about, which is the average age of successful startup founders is counterintuitively 45, not 25.
Yeah.
And I read that, and I was 45 when we started ClickHouse, so it gave me some
There you go.
because
There you
usually
go.
I'm one of the older founders in the room.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.